Welcome. My name is Daniel Rothenberg. I co-direct the Future Security Initiative, which links Arizona State University and New America, a DC-based think tank. And we're really thrilled to be hosting Azadeh Moaveni, who will be speaking tonight on why women play such a key role in Iran's protest movement. Um, Azadeh has been sort of a part of our project, our Future Security Initiative, for many years. She's a journalist, a writer, an academic who's currently an associate professor of journalism at New York University, where she directs the program in global journalism. She's been covering the Middle East for 2 decades and is the author of Guest House for Young Widows, Lipstick Jihad, Honeymoon in Tehran, and co-author with Nobel Laureate Shirin Ebadi of Iran Awakening. She's a former ASU Future Security Fellow at New America. So that's one of the New American National Fellows that we support through our program. And then she previously directed the Gender and Conflict Program at the International Crisis Group. Her writing often appears in the London Review of Books, the New York Times, and many other major media. So Azadeh, thank you so much for joining us. Briefly, everybody, we're going to hear from Azadeh for a bit and then go to Q&A. And when we get to that stage, please just type your questions into the Q&A box in Zoom. And thank you all for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel. Such a kind introduction, and great to be doing this, having this conversation with you and your program, which I really admire. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining. I realize that it's been more than a year now since the first eruption of the Women Life Freedom Movement. I'm just going to talk through where we are now, do a little bit of stock taking. I'll sort of review a little bit about how the movement unfolded, what provoked it, why it didn't end up really generating the kind of really sort of structural massive change that many of the protesters wanted, and sort of where we are now. And then I'd be very happy to just take your questions and talk about anything that you, the audience, find interesting or puzzling about what's been happening in Iran, which is now actually really dramatically overshadowed, of course, by the conflict in Gaza. It was really tremendous on, I believe it was October 5th, when the Iranian human rights lawyer, who's currently and has been in prison in Tehran for some years now, Narges Mohammadi, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And that was an extraordinary moment. It was a global recognition of what I really saw as the mass and mass-supported movement for change in Iran. There were many people who said, "Why not the women of Afghanistan? Look at how they were betrayed," or other sites of struggle, gendered struggle for equality. Is it fair that Iran should have had a second Nobel Peace Laureate after Shirin Ebadi was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2003? I've covered women's movements in the Middle East for many years now, over 2 decades. And I think it's really extraordinary that the protest movement in Iran became a mass movement, that it sort of brought alongside it in solidarity Iranians of all different backgrounds. It was a movement that was generated for gender equality, and it retained that spirit throughout. But it was a mass movement, and I think that that's really something. I don't think there's been, certainly in my career and lifetime, the 25 years that I've covered the Middle East, there has been no large-scale mass protest movement in any country in the region demanding specifically women's rights and equality for women and an end to discrimination against women. So I think that's really something. And the decision of the Nobel Committee to recognize Narges Mohammadi was a tremendous one. And I think it really had the potential to not necessarily revitalize the movement on the ground as a sort of uprising again, but to generate a kind of sense of support for the Iranians inside, who in their own ways are continuing their struggle. And then, of course, 2 days later, this terrible violence erupted in Gaza, and all of that now seems like the distant past. But I'm going to take us back to September of 2022, and look at what happened very quickly, just to remind us. Initially, the protests that sparked what became known as the Women Life Freedom Movement were just simply protests against the death of a young woman who had been arbitrarily detained by the police, by the so-called morality police. She was taken into custody. She was a young woman, 20 years old. She was from a conservative Kurdish family from the provinces, and it was her first time visiting Tehran in the capital. And she was dressed in an incredibly ordinary way, very much conservative by the standards of Tehran, where women, young women, resisting these dress codes has become for years now just a sort of matter of ordinary life. She was wearing a sort of long black robe. She had her hair covered, and she was picked up by the morality police at a metro station, allegedly for, in some manner, having contravened the dress codes. She was put into a police van and taken to a police detention center. There's footage of her, CCTV footage that shows her sort of collapsing in the detention center. And then she was deposited at a hospital for a coma. She was in a coma for 3 days, and then she died. And this death of a young woman, this senseless death of a young woman in police custody caused by this arbitrary detention, sparked incredible outrage in Iran. Why did it spark so much outrage? I think it was because Mahsa Amini, which was Mahsa Jina Amini, her Kurdish name was Jina, she really could have been anyone. She could have been anyone's daughter. She was picked up in a sort of mass transport hub, places that millions of Iranians stream through in and out of their cities, just at a metro station. So her death became one of those iconic moments, I think very similar to the killing of George Floyd in this country, when a particular episode that is reflective of a broader pattern of structural violence and legal injustice is so egregious that it sort of produces a mass societal reaction, a sort of a new form of politics in response to the tragedy. So that was the initial sort of generation of what became and quickly spread into a much larger movement. It spread quickly throughout the country. Suddenly you had dozens and then hundreds of towns and cities where people were spilling out into the streets. The chant that became the emblem of the movement, Women, Life, Freedom, was one of the first chants, and it came from the Kurdish region that Jina was her home, and it has origins in the Kurdish women's movement. And then it quickly sort of transmuted into something else, partly because of the reaction to it. The state moved very quickly to put down the protest in a very brutal way. But also because something about what happened to this young woman transcended a lot of cleavages in Iran. The state of Iran, the Islamic Republic, is used to protests. The country, although extremely authoritarian, has a really long history of protests and activism. There are protests constantly about many things, about corruption, about unpaid salaries, about different parts of the environment being ruined by poor management. There are protests in different provincial areas of Iran that are sort of driven by specific grievances around neglect of Iran's border provinces. There are protests against the imposition of Persian language on border regions where people speak a whole sort of plurality of languages. But this was something very different. And so often those protests kind of flare up and die out because they're very specific to one grievance or one area. But this death of Jina transcended all of that, the usual cleavages. And I think it did become the most sustained and widespread revolt in the history of Iran. It didn't turn out on the streets like the volume of people that have turned out in other episodes of protest in Iran. In 2009, there are 1 to 2 million people on the streets protesting what what was viewed as a stolen election, fraudulence in elections, after a U.S. airstrike assassinated Revolutionary Guards General Qasem Soleimani in Iraq. At least 2 million people turned out on the streets of Iran. So it wasn't the biggest, but it was geographically the most diffuse, and it was the most sustained. The protests went on for weeks. The regime was truly shaken because the protests radicalized as they spread. The chants moved from being really immediately preoccupied with what had happened to Jina and women's rights. Although women were burning their headscarves, they were holding their headscarves on sticks and setting fire to them. There were extraordinary scenes where it was really clear that there was like a ferocious feminist energy at the center of this. But it quickly became about other things. It became a sort of wholesale revolt against the system. So people began to chant death to the dictator. They chanted, we want the end of the Islamic Republic. It reminded me in a sort of accelerated form of the Syrian civil war, which very quickly became a sort of movement to overthrow a repudiation of the whole system. I was there in Tehran at the end of September when this was unfolding. And it was really palpable that this was a sort of different moment or period of protest. The system was really shaken. It shut down the internet. It started really rounding up activists. It became hard to even understand what was going on because at night also, the authorities would scramble the satellite signals that would enable Iranians to watch Persian language satellite news from the outside. So people went to work, to the supermarket, to the coffee shop, to newsstands. And as we learned also in the Arab Spring, there are unintended consequences to the shutting down. When dictators shut down the internet, actually often protests spread. It sends people out into the streets. It really localizes the protests. So through word of mouth, we learned that neighborhoods were mobilizing to protect activists. Sort of shopkeepers and residents would open up their doors in the evening so that if protesters needed to hide during clashes, they could duck in. Doctors would tend injured protesters in private homes because if they were taken to the hospital, then they would be detained. It was also really extraordinary to see the range of people out protesting and also protesting during the day by no longer wearing the headscarf. It was really moving to see elderly women, older women, sometimes violet hair with their hair done, going to do their shopping, going about their lives without the headscarf. I mean, probably they never imagined that they would see a day like that in their lifetimes. So it was frightening for the state to see that there was like this woman-led movement for justice and gender equality, because it wasn't simply about the headscarf. Of course, the headscarf is just a tipping point. Iranian women face profound and extensive discrimination in Iranian law that I could go through with you, but you can imagine the way that they are discriminated against in marriage laws and family law and divorce and child custody. There's a whole range of ways in which their sort of second-class status has been enshrined in law and in life. So quickly, the state really moved to put these protests down. It arrested thousands of protesters. It executed protesters, which of course terrified people who were sort of on the fence or thinking about whether they should join. There were reports of terrible abuse of protesters in detention centers. Even as the protests subsided in response to this very harsh crackdown, there were still further executions. Despite this, I want to talk a little bit about why the protests didn't spread further and why they didn't really ever produce hundreds of thousands of people in the street. It was really palpable in Iran that there's not a huge divide. Society isn't polarized down the middle. Like, it's pretty clear now that there's about a clear majority of 70% of the population that is behind the spirit of the protesters. And then there's a hardcore of maybe 20, maybe between 15 to 25% of the population that backs the system because of ideological fervor, because of financial gain or ties to the system. The majority of the country, though, was behind this. Even the system's own polling shows that the majority of Iranians, even those who are religious and maybe cover their hair, don't believe that it should be mandatory. This is a very outdated law that doesn't have the support of Iranians and that is imposed by force. So why didn't the silent majority turn out? Why did they stay at home? I think there are lots of reasons to this. And if there are any sort of Iran policy heads amongst you, probably you're aware of this. I mean, one element was that the media environment was full of disinformation. And that kind of polluted media environment, I think, can really frighten people. The whole sort of satellite television ecosystem that's run from outside the country was really fueling these protests and backing them and wanting them to really spread and destabilize the system. But in doing so, and sort of spreading disinformation, like going beyond what the state and the regime was actually doing and sort of spreading disinformation and lies about the use of chemical weapons against protesters, about premeditated sort of massacres, like that, none of that was happening. And it frightened people. I would sit in the evening with friends and they would say, like, I can't have that happen to me. Like, I can't risk my child's life. So the sort of radicalized and sort of inflammatory media coverage, I think, raised the stakes so much internally that people were really frightened. Another reality is that the protests really were at the most fierce in Iran's periphery. So Iran is a really heterogeneous and large country. It's 80 million people of multiple different ethnic, linguistic, sectarian backgrounds. There are Iranians there are Sunni Iranians, there are Baha'i Iranians, there are Jewish Iranians. Of course, the majority is Shia. There are Kurds, there are Lurs, there are Baluch, all with their own languages. And these peripheral regions have long been really marginalized by the central government. They're neglected, they don't receive sufficient financial support, they're poor, their levels of education are reduced, and that is very much a deliberate policy. So a lot of the grievances in these areas were driven by like very specific and siloed demands, and some of them did verge on separatist demands. So of course the central government, being very, very skillful at manipulating a sort of age-old Iranian fear of state fragmentation, sort of began to present these protests as an attack on Iran's territorial integrity. And, you know, in the Middle East, where we see countries having been fragmented, Iraq essentially fragmented into three parts, these fears, it was easy for the government to sort of push on these fears. So for various reasons, the harshness of the government crackdown, the heterogeneity of the demands of the protesters. I mean, in some parts of those border regions, Iranians in those border regions can be very, very conservative socially. I've spent time in southern Iran, parts of Iran where you don't see a single woman without a headscarf, even though even before these protests, it was quite common for women to go without headscarves in the big cities. So they're more conservative areas anyway. And so sort of the gender equality, women's liberation sort of essence of the protest as it erupted from Tehran, or as it sort of moved on beyond sort of the anger at the death of this young woman, it became really hard to synthesize those demands. And of course, no leader emerged and no clear agenda emerged for, you know, what is to come next. So for all these reasons, the movement really subsided. And I think it's a painful reality, but I think it really is, today we have to see it as a failed movement in and of itself, but not in a bleak way. It is not a failed process. It is the beginning of a process, or has seen the intensification of a process, which is a very long-term one, which is civil disobedience in Iran, essentially the state, sort of a society moving beyond the state and how it lives its life, ignoring the state. I think part of that sort of dilemma of Iran, or what is sort of contradictory about it, is maybe worth mentioning, though, why these sort of dissonant aspects of Iranian life can exist in the way that they do. I mean, Iranian society, what it's like to live in Iran today as a woman is very different than is often presented from the outside. Literacy in Iran is very high. Women outnumber men at universities. Women direct films, they write books, they top bestseller lists. They have access to decent levels of contraception and healthcare. They have the right to vote. They have the right to own property. It is a very different sort of state of affairs for women, despite the very discriminatory sort of legal codes that I mentioned earlier that they live under. So, I mean, Iranian women's expectations are here, the reality of their lives are here, and then the law is here. So you can imagine the kind of sort of antagonism that there is between a society that is well beyond, where it's essentially now minority dictatorship government wants it to be. Women face a lot of cost for having achieved the level of social and political participation and centrality that they do, despite everything that they're up against. But also this young generation of women, this fearless Gen Z, 15 to 8-year-olds, which was the median age of protesters on the streets during this time. They're very young. They're the product of the Islamic Republic. They were all born after the 1979 revolution. So in a way, it's very frightening for the state to sort of confront its failure. These are the products of its entire educational and state project. But I think it's really important to also recognize the rights and status that women do have in order to understand why they have the capacity and the desire to demand so much more. What else did I want to tell you about? One of the really sort of mysterious and strange episodes in all of this that I reported on for the New Yorker was a mysterious sort of spate of poisonings in Iranian girls' schools that unfolded in sort of December to February of last year. And that was also very frightening, of course, for Iranians. It was unclear who was responsible, but suddenly across the country, schoolgirls were falling ill. They had symptoms of nausea and seizures. And some of them were being rushed to the hospital, and reporters who were working on this story to understand were being detained. And suddenly there was like an epidemic of schoolgirls across the country being taken ill. And it caused really incredible mass fear. Whoever was doing this or whatever it was had really enormous resources at its disposal. So this was a sort of another sort of strange chapter in what unfolded. And of course, it's important to note the girls' schools were a particular site of rebellion. Girls in Iran, of course, the minute that they enter the education system, their school uniform includes a headscarf or a hijab. But for girls, it's a sort of cloak that they have to put over their heads. And schoolgirls, it was really extraordinary as this sort of protest movement erupted, would come out of school and they would tear their headscarves off and they would chant in the streets. And people were, of course, videoing this, and it would ricochet all over the internet. And they were completely fearless. And it looked like this militarized, strong regime couldn't even put down the unrest of schoolgirls. So schools became like a real theater of confrontation. The girls would just not put on the uniform, and the state didn't know what to do. I mean, how much pressure can you put on teachers? The teachers most of them even believe that the girls should be doing this. So there was a whole sort of dimension of sort of societal versus state tension being acted out at the level of essentially teenagers. And it was very frightening for parents, of course, to think that maybe someone was poisoning their girls at school. That episode passed. It was really shocking to Iranians to see that sort of even children, school children, would not be spared in what seemed like certainly a related element of what was unfolding. But schoolgirls till today, in the parts of the country where sort of societally and demographically young women and families do not expect or want their girls to have to forcibly cover their hair, don't wear it anymore. And that's really a victory. I think sometimes from the outside, we sort of measure the success or sort of outcome of a movement, in this sort of grandest ways. Like, did the regime fall? No. Was it ultimately successful in putting down the unrest? Yes. But has Iranian life changed significantly? Yes. I, started out in Iran, and I'm going to end in a moment. But I started out reporting in Iran in the late 90s. And it was a time of real suffocation and fear around these dress codes. I mean, the state had the upper hand. It was powerful. It had checkpoints. You would be constantly hassled anywhere you went for your sleeves not being long enough, for the color being wrong, for the slightest thing. I mean, it was really like an experience of daily harassment to exist in Iran as a woman 25 years ago. And now, to go to a coffee shop in the middle of Tehran and to see women sitting without the headscarf. The law has not changed, but Iranians have annulled the law. And of course, it must be acknowledged that the state is trying to double down. It's passed an even more repressive series of dress codes and hijab laws. But in practice, women won. Women won. And I think that's really something. I think it's exciting for me to see young girls in my family, nieces and others going out without that fear, without that anxiety, in the same way that my generation grew up with. So, the struggle for change and for gender equality in Iran is a really long one. It began in earnest in the early 20th century, and it will go on well beyond me. And it has a complex history in women's also struggles and participation in anti-imperial and anti-colonial movements, and it is a long road. So I'll stop there, and maybe if there's any questions, we can sort of talk about anything that you'd like.
Thank you so much, Azadeh. I have a question to pick up on what you were saying just towards the tail end of your comments, where you said women won. And you compared the situation now in Tehran, where you can go to coffee shops and you see women without headscarves, and yet the incident that sparked the last set of protests and a lot of the reporting about the country focus on the morality police, and the feeling one gets is that there's a constant sense of danger and uncertainty, particularly for women, but really for anybody who runs afoul of these laws. So is it true that when you're at a coffee shop in Tehran, that the folks there are simply not afraid or concerned of a visit from the morality police?
It's a good question, and I realize it's a sort of murky reality to try and convey. I mean, the possibility of the morality police stopping someone and rounding them up again or hassling them, of course, still exists. There was an incident, I think, last month or the month before, similar to what happened to Mahsa Amini, a murkier one. But what has really changed is like multiple layered societal dynamics. So the government, the state doesn't want to be the one doing the policing anymore since it's so deeply unpopular. So it tries to impose the cost on private citizens, like you grocery store owner, you coffee shop owner, like you'll be shut down. So you become the enforcer on behalf of the state, so that it's not sort of in such a costly direct confrontation anymore. But for the most part, they refuse. And so that's been like an element. So before, often someone would come up to you in a coffee shop and say, oh, if you don't mind, can you please cover your hair? In some places, because of course, the state is more sensitive to some parts of the city than others. So that's one element. Also now people get sort of mobilized. So if a woman is approached or she's told to cover her hair, like suddenly there will be 5 people around her often. I think that the anxiety and the fear is dramatically diminished. I mean, the costs and the consequences are real. They happen more seldom, but they're still very possible. But I think that, especially for young people, just the fear is gone, even though they know that the cost can be very high.
So do you think if the fear is gone, that this suggests either a high chance that there'll be another mass set of protests, or that there'll be sort of some other substantive political shift that will realize the lack of fear on the part of so many?
Definitely. I think it's a definite sort of inevitability that there will be another space or sort of public response. I mean, Iranians right now are, I mean, I can't even begin to explain how bleak and awful the condition is for Iranians right now in the country. They are the most sanctioned country in the world. Iran is basically cut out of the global banking system. What happened to Venezuela, the sanctions regime against Venezuela that caused millions of Venezuelan migrants to flee their country because it was in a state of economic collapse to come to this country, like that's what's happening to Iran and has been for years. Much of this is to be laid. The blame is to be laid at the hands of the state for its policies in the region, for its postures, for its corruption and its mismanagement. It is an atrocious record in almost every respect. But also essentially what is economic war that is being waged on Iran by the United States and the West is an element of this too. So Iran today is like a besieged, impoverished population that used to have a thriving middle class that studied abroad, that was constantly, like its graduates were being recruited to Stanford and MIT. It's being diminished in the way that the Iraqi middle class was under the sanctions that the Saddam Hussein regime was suffering. So all to say that the situation is actually very bleak. Iranians' prospects are very bleak, and their anger at the system is bottomless. So it will just take a spark. I mean, sometimes it's an earthquake, like in Turkey. Sometimes it's a tragedy, like Masa Jina Amini. It's hard to know what the spark will be, but I don't see how 80 million people can be treated in this way, like an old, proud civilization that has a history of deep political engagement can sort of be asked to sort of to cower and to suffer in the way that they are.
A question here from Miriam Mala. Thank you so much, Azadeh. I would like to know your take on how the Iranian regime, being a theocracy that is clearly spreading its influence regionally, how this threat to women's rights spreads farther than Iran. As we can see, countries such as Iraq, for example, prior to the fall of the Ba'athist Saddam regime, enjoyed many freedoms similar to Iran pre-revolution. However, even with the fall of the regime, which should not have regressed women's rights, we see that Iranian influence is strong. So, what's the regional impact on women's rights of Iran's efforts to affect countries outside its borders?
That's a really fantastic question. I think I'll answer it in 2 ways. And I'll sort of give my own sort of personal reading of this. And I've worked extensively in Iraq and Syria. I've worked on Yemen, like these spheres of Iranian influence. I think that what has most eroded women's security and prospects in those countries is war and conflict, not Iranian influence. I mean, Iranian influence is part of that picture because, of course, the invasion of Iraq in 2003 basically fragmented the regional order in a way that then led to the rise of the Islamic State and the collapse of Syria. So, of course, Iran supports and sustains a network of militias in the country who are also very religiously inflected, but in very local ways. So what I see is, Iran is part of a regional picture where conflicts are endemic And there are other countries that are also fueling those conflicts, of course. I mean, the Saudis and the Emiratis sort of prolonged the war in Yemen for years. And it was the war in Yemen that was destroying and impoverishing. Yemen became the world's largest humanitarian catastrophe. And I think that was a result of the war, which came out of the Yemeni civil war. And eventually Iran moved in to sort of try and align itself with militias and extend its networks as part of that. But in the Yemen story, for example, the Houthis are a Yemeni reality. They are an organic part of Yemeni society. And if they're conservative, that is a Yemeni story. So I think that, constant secure, like a fragmented state with poor security that's really securitized and that's overrun by militias, of course, is just very bad for women. Is Iran a part of that picture? Yes. Did Iran create that picture? No. I mean, all of this was essentially triggered by the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Before that, the Taliban had their own sort of stranglehold on Afghanistan. Like they're their own Deobandi Sunni fundamentalist project. They're the, sworn enemy of Iran. Saddam Hussein had a secular Iraq, which in many ways, secular, stable, deeply authoritarian, but in many ways better for women. Syria, which is a very close ally of Iran, is actually a quite secular society. And the secular Assad regime and the theocratic Islamic Republic have been the best of allies to each other in the region in ways that have not really impacted women's lives in Syria, other than that, that is a deeply autocratic country whose repression and its own brutal civil war has sort of ruined lives for women in another way. So, I mean, it's a roundabout way of saying that, and essentially, I think Iran runs a military, like a defensive military posture in the region. And it's a much more military reality than an ideological one now. And that many of the spheres in which Iran is active, the gendered realities for women are a sort of organic reflection of that place at its moment in a deeply fragmented way.
Question from Carolyn Reed. In some feminist or gender-central movements, men can play an important role, either as complicit oppressors or as allies. What about in this case? What would you say about the role of men during this movement? That's
a great question, too. Men were really tremendous in this movement. I think actually men were, and this is so interesting to me, because this was also the case in the Arab Spring uprisings. Women were at the forefront of both. And men, sort of in deeply patriarchal societies, find it shaming that the women are the more bold and the more aggressive. And so they, of course, have to go out after the women are the ones who are galvanizing. Men in women life freedom were side by side with women. And I think that really says something. I've had debates with Afghan feminist friends about, which countries women should have had the Nobel Prize. And I think, you can look at Afghanistan and you see those women who protest on the streets of Kabul now, they are alone. There are like 20 of them, and there are no men alongside them. There is no solidarity like on any scale with Afghan women. And that is a societal reality. That is a reality of where Afghanistan is as a country today. And the fact that men were out with women. And I think that there's like a deeper question here that we're getting at. It's like, I think in Iran, men and women have evolved to the point where they see that citizenship is not gendered. Like that Baluch man, that Kurdish Iranian man, like these men from the provinces or the border regions, they see that citizenship is either respected or it's not. And if you're going to be marginalized or discriminated against and abused as a woman, you will also be, if you're a low status man, or if you're a man from an ethnicity or a linguistic group that is not part of the mainstream. So I think there's been a really interesting evolution where men and women see that their fates are intertwined. And so I think that's part of why men were out. They were part of the movement. They were shoulder to shoulder, and they didn't feel themselves in any way diminished by being part of what was really, in its origin and fundamentally to the end as its core sort of energy, a feminist movement.
Thanks so much. From Gary Grossman, is there a role for outsiders to assist the women's movement in Iran, or might that cause problems for the movement?
Such a good question. Um, I'm really of the belief that direct intervention, direct intervention causes problems. Um, Iranian women have been sort of tied to and invoked so many times in the course of the U.S. government's engagement with Iran. Like very famously, when President Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal that President Obama had negotiated, they set it up as almost like driven by their concern for Iranian women. They like suddenly the State Department was tweeting about the bravery of Iranian women. Secretary Pompeo kept talking about Iranian women in his speeches and how Iranian women were going to defeat the mullahs. And that sort of support that was very craven and very cynical because it was a Trump project to sort of blow up an achievement of Obama diplomacy. It was part of a very misguided path to sort of engage the Arab autocrats like Saudi Arabia and the UAE and pander to them as part of their sort of Abrahamic Accords vision. A path that we now see today is clearly led us to like utter disaster. But sort of the Iran policy, the disaster that was the Trump administration's Iran policy, was framed as being inspired by, tethered to the aspirations of Iranian women. And that was really terrible. It really securitized the atmosphere even further inside the country. Every Iranian feminist or activist was sort of painted as working for a foreign power, being on the payroll. That stuff happens anyway, those accusations, but it made it even worse. And it associated support for Iranian women from the West with a terrible sort of militancy, like a destructiveness. I mean, how many times did Pompeo threaten to annihilate Iran, to bomb Iran, to sanction Iran? And so I think it is not helpful. When Iran policy in the United States is so tethered to what I think is a disastrous regional policy, bringing women into it can have no good, because women's security in Iran will be bolstered and strengthened when Iran is no longer a suffocated pariah state. And I don't mean that it should simply be accepted on its own terms and be free to do whatever it's like, but Iran is a reality. It's like a powerful 80 million strong country in the middle of the region. It's like too big to isolate and ignore for decades without serious instability and pain as a result. So, I think the biggest thing that could help from the outside is a sort of reimagining of the US's security relationship with the region and its individual relations with states like Israel and Saudi and the UAE in a way that just lowers tension in the region. That, how many wars and conflicts does this region have to endure? And the long-standing enmity between the U.S. and Iran is at the heart of that, and has been part of the U.S. sort of regional posture for years. And I will say quickly that it has also been very convenient for Israel to sort of shift the strategic focus always on Iran, to sort of distract from its own domestic inability to resolve how it's going to live alongside these Palestinians. So, like, this is just, it is a question that has taken me down like a whole sort of strategic morass of a response, but to say that like these are all very embedded sort of security conundrums in the region, and like bringing Iranian women into any of that when the problem is like a massive historic geostrategic sort of entanglement doesn't help at all.
Question here from Noah McGee. With such limited access to information and heavy usage of misinformation by the government, How did the protests in Iran initially begin? And how can you see this happening again in the future? I can imagine if the government tried to cover it up um, uh, with her family being located outside of Tehran, it's interesting to try to understand how the specific events sparked such widespread protests.
Um, well, very immediate. I mean, the internet was not shut down immediately. It was slow. But when it did, people began to organize in a very old school way. It became very localized, like neighborhoods would agree, like, where do we meet every night at 6 p.m.? And so they would meet at a particular intersection and then they would disperse very quickly, or they would pass out flyers like the old, like in the old style, like 100 years ago, when there were uprisings in Kandahar, like it was called Shabnameh or something, like the night letter, like people would pass them out. So there are all these kind of very analog, old school methods that people used, and that was really also essential for just dispersing, because that was a strategy of the protesters. I mean, it's impossible to completely shut down communications, though. I mean, those satellite televisions would still be able to beam in for some periods of the day, and some of them were explicitly announcing where protests would be held. They would say tonight at 8 p.m. at this intersection in this neighborhood of this city. I mean, these are news organizations. They're not meant to be functioning in that way, but they were. So this kind of mix of, getting some information through the cracks. Very quickly, people started getting different VPNs on their phones that would allow them to bypass some of the blockages on the phone, and then the VPNs became like a whole industry unto themselves, and people found loopholes. So like a mix of these methods, and I think, if anything were to erupt again, it would be the same thing. There are like various cracks. Now people sort of are entirely expert, like the whole country is expert on how to use a VPN to be able to use WhatsApp and to be able to access the internet freely through your phone. So I think that would just be the sort of the replay, if anything were to demand a sort of second crackdown on how people communicate with each other.
A question here from Zaina Baraka. Thank you so much, Azadeh. What do you think would be empowering for protest organizers right now to reignite some momentum? And then a second question, would it be possible to speak to the art scene in Tehran and if it has had any changes or any particular role in the protests? So two questions.
Wow, so really good questions from your audience. What could reignite right now? That's a tricky one, and I'm not sure what it could be. I mean, oftentimes things are reignited by negative occurrences. So if something bad happens to another girl, if a woman dies in police custody, so it's a reaction to a very unexpected event, or like a black swan kind of event. What could be done deliberately? I mean, I think also that we're sort of beyond that sort of street protest uprising phase. So, what could be done? I mean, I think that the support that Iranian women get from civil society outside the country is really tremendous. So while I think definitely that if you have like a Secretary of State like Pompeo, perhaps he shouldn't be talking about Iranian women because that creates all sorts of difficulties for them, knowing that women's activists, that different sort of strands of activism are thinking about them, that they're threaded into their like agendas and their sort of universe for change, I think can really make a difference. And then, I mean, at the end of the day, I will say that I think as long as there are sanctions on Iran, like the prospects for women are very poor. Iranian women's activism is shaped by their material reality. If you're very poor and you're working 3 jobs and you're looking after a sick mother, like you're not going to have like a feminist magazine also on the side. Like you can do that when you're middle class and you have the time. So that's another thing. I mean, I think those material realities really matter. And like, as we on the outside who have concerns for Iranian women and their aspirations have to be really realistic about knowing that, using sanctions as a tool to essentially punish an entire civilian population for the decisions of its leaders has very serious implications for the potential on the lives of women and girls. So that's one thing. On the art scene, but it was really interesting. So initially, the art scene basically shut down because for about 6 months, there was this kind of view that there can be no normalcy. So galleries were shut, concerts were canceled, no fashion shows, nothing, like nothing was going on. It was like a boycott by the art scene against the idea that normalcy could continue while this movement was being brutalized or while this resistance was going on. And then after some months, that really started to change because obviously, of course, all these artists are suffering. They need to be able to work, and they began to see that this is going to be really a marathon, and we can resist, and we can be, we can continue our activism, and we can do what we do, and we can work alongside that. So the sort of art scene reemerged. And then, of course, in response, there was a lot of really extraordinary responses in music and in other spheres. I mean, music was the one that was easiest to follow. And of course, that sort of song that Jill Biden recognized at the Grammys, which was a sort of song written for the protesters. It was called Baraye For, and it sort of goes through all of the people who were out on the streets and what they were there for and what they were seeking. And so that was really tremendous. But I think there will be more. Certainly there will be more. It might be seen as also a security threat, and that's a sort of disturbing reality too, because in a way the art scene has in Iran been kind of protected from the tumult of politics in the last several years, and it's flourished because of that. So that's another thing to think about.
Question here from Carolyn Reed. So taking it back to the name of the event, why are women so important for the movement? Were they the spark or the drivers? What would have happened without them? And maybe more broadly, like, to what degree was the women's protest movement, so salient for general political concerns in Iran?
Well, so women, that's a really good question too. I mean, women have consistently been, since the 1979 revolution, the only group that has opposed this system as a group, as a sort of coherent political group. Like the first protest against the Islamic Republic in 1979, after it came to power, was by women who were on the street protesting the mandatory hijab. And they have been the only group who has consistently come out year after year after year opposing the system. So they are the sort of through line from the beginning of the creation of the system to today. They are like the coherent, persistent socio-political group that in its own sort of very coherent way has challenged the system in its core being. So they're important because of that continuity, but they're also important because, I mean, women cut across all those cleavages. Like women cross all of those class divides. There are women of all religious backgrounds. There are women of, urban, rural, different linguistic. Like in the end, all the women of all those groups are second-class citizens, and they all feel that terrible discrimination in their lives. And so that's a really powerful commonality in a way that men don't have. Like men of all those groups still get to benefit from patriarchy in the end, whereas women don't. So it's a powerful sort of mobilizing collective identity to have. And they have been really a force, even well before in the 2000s, they had a really vibrant women's rights movement, like up from the grassroots going around the country. So they've also historically been really organized. They've been well networked with other feminists in the region and in the world, of course, much less so now that Iran is so isolated and contained. but they've had sort of a developed movement with very specific demands. And I think that has helped them too. We want the changes to these laws. We don't want to be discriminated against in these ways. Like there are certain ways that you can reshape a system through its laws. Although, when a system is unresponsive, then you just get mass protests because people see those avenues are blocked, of course. So, I mean, because also women and gender ideology is at the very heart of this system. It is a system that is predicated on the mandatory headscarf and the submission. It demands the submission of women. And so for all of these reasons, like women have been at the forefront, they've been at the center of the regime's sort of own sort of sense of itself. And they have also been its greatest vulnerability. And they've also been really super brave in coming out. So it's always the women, and it's always about women, because in a way, women are a sort of parable for also the wounded nation, to be metaphorical about it.
Have you seen in your reporting and working around that women of different groups and different classes and different regions find greater commonality and work more closely together than, say, the men that are defined by the same sorts of divisions and barriers and differences? And if so, why?
Yeah. I mean, I think they've just had a sort of common agenda for so long. And a common agenda that has cut across all of these divisions. I mean, and this goes back to the 1920s and the 1930s when girls' schools were being built and women were trying to get into parliament. And I mean, ultimately, I don't think women have been, I mean, their shared sense of womanhood and their aspirations. I mean, I think women have seen that their gender is the one thing that is going to prevent them from getting through their lives in the way that they want, in a way that being, working class versus like lower middle class versus being of this religion or of that religion, like those things are secondary or tertiary. And I think that just made the women's movement a much broader tent. There's been like really good journalism by women that sort of shown women through journalism that like what is happening to you in this region is the same as that region. And there's been a sort of shared sense of struggle in that way through the media as well. And I think there's just a long history of this. Iran does have, I keep talking about the women's movement, but it does go back many years, and women have many very formidable sort of national sort of leaders and icons to look back to who've commanded respect and admiration across all these communities. So yeah, I think there's just a history of being knitted together in this struggle, and recognizing that it varies. Like for Kurdish women, there might be like a slightly different like level of priority, for example, for dealing with child marriage than there will be in Tehran. There might be a different set of priorities, but because the legal system now is so atrocious for women, some of the basic demands are sort of shared across the board.
Well, thank you so much, Azadeh, and thanks everybody for joining us this evening. You ended your presentation with the sort of statement that we don't usually hear about coming through an analysis of Iran, which was that the women won. So that's a fascinating thing to think about. And thanks for all your reporting and your hard work. And thank you, everybody, and wish you a good night.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to everyone. It was really my pleasure.